A journey through the archetypes of death and resurrection, myths, religions, and the construction of Christianity throughout human history. Narratives of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption have resonated across various cultures and religious traditions. The idea of a divine being who is persecuted, suffers, and ultimately returns to life has been a recurring theme in ancient mythologies. But did these stories influence Christianity? Or was the resurrection of Jesus a truly unique event? In this study, we will delve deeply into the similarities between Jesus and other myths that preceded him, analyzing how the history of Christianity may have been shaped by earlier influences. To understand this, we must go back in time and explore the rich cultural and religious fabric in which Christianity emerged. The archetype of the dying and rising God long before the New Testament was written, different civilizations already shared narratives about gods who died and returned to life. These myths reflected natural cycles, such as the seasons, and were used to make sense of the world and human destiny. In Egyptian mythology, we find the story of Osiris, a god betrayed and murdered by his own brother, whose remains were scattered across the world. His wife, Isis, moved by love and devotion, gathered his body and, through divine magic, brought him back to life. This resurrection made Osiris the ruler of the underworld and a symbol of spiritual renewal. Centuries later, Persian myths told of Mithra, a celestial being born of a virgin who sacrificed himself for the good of humanity and ascended to the heavens after his death. His followers believed that one day he would return to judge the living and the dead. In Greece, the cult of Dionysus also narrated his violent death and subsequent rebirth. The son of a god and immortal, Dionysus was torn apart by Titans, but his essence was preserved and reborn, bringing with him the promise of eternal life for his devotees. These stories were not merely fantastical tales but central elements of ancient religions that helped people cope with the mysteries of death and renewal. So how might these narratives have influenced the story of Christianity? Christianity, a new religion in a world of old myths. In the Greco-Roman world, religions coexisted and often merged. The Roman Empire was a true patchwork of beliefs and spiritual practices, and the Romans were accustomed to incorporating foreign gods into their pantheon. This religious flexibility allowed elements of older religions to survive and merge into new traditions. Historian Mary Beard explains that the Romans saw gods as forces to be appeased. If one god disappointed them, they turned to another who seemed more powerful. This religious adaptability created space for the spread of Christianity, which, over the centuries, assimilated many of these ancient mythological concepts. The New Testament itself seems to echo ancient myths, especially in the accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection. A notable example is the story of Lazarus. Scholar Randall Helms points out that the resurrection of Lazarus bears striking parallels with the resurrection of Osiris. Both had been dead for days, both were called back to life by someone with divine powers, and both became symbols of spiritual renewal. Furthermore, the original name of Osiris in Egypt was Azar, while Lazarus, in Hebrew, is Eliezer. The city where the Osiris myth developed was called Heliopolis, and the city where Lazarus was resurrected is Bethany, whose name has linguistic roots that connect to ancient Egypt. These similarities suggest that the Gospel writers may have drawn inspiration from pre-existing stories to create a narrative that resonated with the beliefs of the time. Contradictions in the resurrection accounts. If the resurrection of Jesus were a concrete historical event with solid documentation, we would expect consistent accounts in the Gospels. However, there are significant discrepancies between the different resurrection accounts. Paul, the first to write about the resurrection, mentions that Jesus appeared first to Peter. Yet the Gospels say the first appearance was to a group of women. Moreover, Paul speaks of an appearance to the 12, but Judas had already died by this time, so who were these 12 disciples? Other differences appear in the details of the empty tomb. In Mark, the women find the tomb already opened. In Matthew, an angel descends and removes the stone before their eyes. In Luke, two men appear beside the open and empty tomb, and in John, it is Mary Magdalene who finds Jesus alone. These variations indicate that the narratives were adapted and reinterpreted over time. The psychological impact of Jesus' death for Jesus' followers, his crucifixion was a devastating event. They had abandoned everything to follow him, believing he would bring a new kingdom. When he was executed, their hopes were shattered. How did they cope with this loss? Researcher Gerd Ludemann argues that the visions of Jesus' resurrection may have resulted from intense psychological experiences. Deep grief can lead to visions and hallucinations, something well documented in modern psychology. Some disciples, especially Peter, may have experienced these visions and convinced others that Jesus was alive. This phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance, occurs when someone holds a strong belief that conflicts with reality. Instead of abandoning the belief, they reinterpret the facts to justify their faith. Thus, the idea that Jesus resurrected may have emerged as a way to cope with pain and frustration. Christianity and the myth of the virgin birth. Another key element of Christianity is Jesus' virgin birth. However, this idea also has parallels in other religions. Krishna, in Hindu tradition, was miraculously conceived and escaped a massacre of newborns ordered by a tyrant king, a storyline similar to Jesus and Herod. In Egypt, Isis conceived Horus without a human father, making him a divine son destined to save his people. Curiously, the New Testament itself uses an incorrect translation of Hebrew when describing the virgin birth. The prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 mentions that a young woman will give birth, but it was erroneously translated as virgin. This mistake helped construct the myth of Jesus' miraculous birth. Conclusion. Christianity, a new interpretation of old ideas. Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. It inherited and transformed earlier myths, adapting them to a new context and giving them renewed meaning. Thus, Jesus Christ became a perfected ideal, shaped by centuries of cultural and religious influences. The final question we must ask is not whether Jesus existed, but what his story represents for us today. Can his message of love and compassion be separated from the mythical elements surrounding it? And more importantly, what lessons can we draw from this phenomenon to better understand our own spiritual and historical journey?